Welcome to the second talk of this series on peace, freedom and free will in the light of Theosophia or universal wisdom. Working for the liberation of all life. If you are hearing this for the first time, I can imagine that this sounds like something that is theoretical maybe and somewhat distant from you. But I hope to make clear in this lecture that this is precisely the most natural thing there is. And that it also makes perfect sense if you assume that all life is connected to each other, that each is part of a whole, and that everything we think or do affects that whole. And on the other hand, if we don't know how that whole works, we often, out of ignorance and unconsciously, work against it, with dire consequences. Consequences that we see day in, day out in the news. So knowledge about the oneness of life and the spiritual laws to be derived from this can help prevent disharmony and show us the path to peace. And of course this is not just about knowledge or ideas, but above all expressing them in your life, working for them. We are of course going to explain this step by step. We will do this by means of three questions. First, what is work and what do we work for? Secondly, what is liberation? And thirdly, what does working for the liberation for all life mean? Each question will be answered in a separate part of this talk, after each of which there is time for questions and answers. The first section will take a bit longer than usual, but the second and especially the third will be somewhat shorter. So why do we begin with work in general? We are starting with this theme because there is something wrong with our work. Now every human being intuitively wants to add value to the whole, to have a function and be of use, and work is the expression of that. It is the reason why many people become unhappy or even depressed when unemployed for long periods of time. Prisoners generally prefer working in prison to just spending their time in a cell, even if it is boring or dirty work, such as ironing shirts or cleaning toilets. It is even a form of punishment to refuse them that work. This also shows that man is not a calculating homo economicus, who stops working as soon as he gets the chance. Lottery winners with millions generally don't stop working, although most of the time they work a bit less. But when they do stop completely, they usually regret it. But although work contributes to our self-esteem and can be a source of meaning, work is at the same time a source of suffering for many. It leads to stress, exhaustion, and sometimes even to exploitation or modern slavery. Think about the fast fashion factories in third world countries or the fatal conditions of labor in Qatar that preceded the organization of the World Cup. So we want to shine the theosophical light on this, because we hope that with these ideas we can alleviate to some extent the source of suffering, or perhaps even help people to eliminate it surrounding current day work. But what exactly is work? Let's start with a working definition. And for that, Wikipedia is always a good source. There it says that work or labor is intentional activity people perform to support the needs and wants of themselves, others, or a wider community. And what are we actually working for? We'll try to illustrate that first with a brief history. Work is of course part of life. To meet our daily needs we will have to work, gathering food, hunting or farming, finding or making shelter for lodging, clothing and fuel to keep ourselves warm, etc. It is the necessary work for our livelihood. But our present work has long since ceased to be only about the livelihood. Ever since the development of agriculture, but mainly also during the Industrial Revolution that began in the Western world, the idea arose that we needed to be productive with work, and preferably as productive as possible. We work not only for our own livelihood, but made more and more products that could be traded and with which we could become more and more prosperous. Later in the West, work was increasingly seen as wage labor, something by which you earn money on behalf of an employer, either temporarily or in permanent employment. That idea is emphatically Western, because in other cultures, think of for instance African cultures, it is still seen as strange that you are dependent on wages for your livelihood and cannot, for example, fall back on a village, community or family that cultivates or owns land and provides for its own livelihood. So we are now working mostly for wages. But wages are increasingly lagging behind our productivity. This graph of the productivity payment gap shows that. Until the late 1970s, this was going evenly. But slowly but surely wages have lagged behind productivity growth. Now, one reason for this is that the gains achieved from more productivity increasingly benefit only a small group. It explains the growing inequality between rich and poor. And it also means that the idea of the self-made man, the idea of meritocracy, is a myth. Hard work is no longer a guarantee of climbing up the social ladder. Even a job as a guarantee of livelihood is now in jeopardy. It used to be enough to support a family on one salary. Now it is barely doable, especially on a modal salary. If you look at the US, people sometimes have 2 or even 3 jobs at the same time to pay the bills. That people cannot make ends meet from their jobs is not inevitable. In fact, a small group of people, and in the rich West we almost all belong to this if we look through it on a global scale, are profiting from the hard work done by others elsewhere. Well, there is actually already a lot of wealth in rich countries. But even here we are still obsessed with achieving more productivity and profit maximization. Because if you look at the growth of productivity, the question is whether automation, for example, now solves that much. An example. There was an idea to abolish all the ticket offices on the London Underground and replace them with machines. This was the reaction of the people whose jobs were affected. They wrote an advice to passengers using the future London Underground. Please ensure that you are thoroughly familiar with London Underground's 11 lines and 270 stations before travelling. Please ensure that there are no delays to your journey, or any accidents, emergencies, incidents or evacuations. Please do not be alarmed if there are no staff on the station and no one driving your train. Please do not be disabled, or poor, or new to London. Please avoid being too young or too old. Please do not be harassed or assaulted while traveling. Please do not lose your property or your children. And please do not require assistance. In short, with our obsession with increased productivity, we lose sight of what work was originally intended for. To care for each other, to be there for each other. The London Underground example shows that this is what adds the most value from a human over a machine. The human interaction and care. And this is usually taken for granted. Consider also women's caring tasks. Housekeeping, cooking, raising children. These tasks have fallen primarily to women since the emergence of paid work. Historically, the woman provided reproductive tasks and the man the productive ones. And in the days when work was expressed in terms of wages, a feminist wave emerged in the 1970s that pointed out that all this unpaid work by women was also work, and therefore should be paid in return. Now the point was not so much that they were not paid, but that this also allowed them to strike as a collective to demand for better conditions. The question then is whether work now really is emancipating. The second wave feminists insisted that they could also do the same wage labor as men. And in the West, where there is hardly a job a woman can do anymore these days, there is still a gender pay gap, and women in Europe spend an average of 17 hours in unpaid work versus an average of 10 hours by men. But the question is whether equally contributing to a system based on equality, on inequality, is really liberating. Because people with well-paid jobs are dependent on others with low wages who take over, for example, the cleaning tasks, childcare, or cook and deliver meals. One wonders if the average work is not moving more and more in the direction of a form of exploitation. The deadly working conditions surrounding the hosting of the World Cup in Qatar are, of course, a well-known example. But actually, the very existence of low-wage countries where, among other things, our fast fashion and our cell phones are made, are an example of exploitation. See also the graph again. The profit we achieve with the growth in labor productivity disappears into the pockets of a small group that gets richer and richer. Inequality between rich and poor continues to grow, and the question is how long that is sustainable. And finally, work is also increasingly a source of exhaustion for many people. Global burnout rates are high. According to a global workplace report recently, 43% of people from over 100 countries claim to have experienced workplace burnout, rising from 39% in 2019. This was from 2022. Then there is the phenomenon of so-called bullshit jobs. Jobs that the people who have them say themselves are actually meaningless, perhaps even harmful. And recent research in the Netherlands shows that 40% of the workers cannot justify the usefulness of their work. And it makes many people unhappy. And at the same time, exhaustion occurs in jobs that actually do contribute to the common good, especially in organizations or governmental systems that go crazy with efficiency thinking. Then deterioration and exhaustion occurs. Now during Corona it suddenly became very clear to everyone which are these most contributing jobs. They were called essential, crucial or vital occupations. Those of policemen, doctors, nurses, package deliverers, teachers, cleaners, farmers, builders, bus drivers, garbage collectors, etc. Now the strange thing is that many of these jobs, with exceptions such as those of doctors, are badly paid and often cause the most workload and work-related stress. Yet these people generally rate their work very highly because of its added value. And only when things have become really bad do they go on strike for better working conditions. And when they strike, think of garbage collectors, people in public transport or teachers, we all notice it immediately. Now compare that to a strike of bankers as once occurred in Ireland. It went on for 6 months and nobody noticed anything. People just wrote checks to each other, it all worked fine. Reluctantly, the bankers quietly went back to work. So we have now briefly outlined some of the issues surrounding today's work. Time to get to the root cause of this. Let's return again to Wikipedia's definition. Work or labor is intentional activity people perform to support the needs and wants of themselves, others, or a wider community. So there is intention, there are needs and wants to be fulfilled. And these needs and wants can come from ourselves, but also from others and the community we are part of. But who exactly are these selves whom we are talking about? Where do our needs and wants and those of others or our community originate? To answer that question I will go back to our Theosophical fundamentals, but I will already state our conclusion in advance that our work mirrors ourselves as a part of our karma. I will explain. Now the work we do all starts with our vision on life. Work is one of the forms in which we express ourselves as part of the greater whole that we form together. And the moment we realize this unity more deeply, we will also make different choices regarding work. But it starts with a different mentality. Now the Theosophia, or divine or universal wisdom, has 3 starting principles. Boundlessness, first, cyclicity, secondly, and the fundamental equality of all life as the third one. This boundlessness extends in all directions, in place, in duration, in consciousness and movement. Like we explained in the previous lecture, it can be compared to a boundless ocean of life. And just like in the ocean, you see cyclically all kinds of waves or ripples appearing and disappearing. Now every living being can be seen as such a wave in the boundless ocean of consciousness. Such a waving motion is never isolated. It is always a consequence of something preceding it and also propels other waves or ripples. Also, such a wave is composed of countless smaller ripples and the inseparable drops that make up such a ripple. Finally, such a wave can never be separated from the ocean. It appears to be separate, but it is nothing but a ripple on the surface of the ocean, and it also has within it everything potentially contained in the whole ocean. So in essence, each wave is also equal to each other. But each wave, and this is where the metaphor ends more or less, will have to go on through its own evolution to become one with the ocean again, according to its own potential. At the same time, there is always cooperation, and each larger being creates the opportunities for smaller beings to go through its evolution within the sphere of the larger being, as above, so below. Since such an ocean does provide a physical example, we also made a comparison with an orchestra. You could say that reality is an interplay, a dynamic harmony or music that we all make together. We can contribute to that harmony, or peace, or justice, or we can go against it, by not playing along or cheating, whether we are conscious of it or not. This also shows that the laws of nature are essentially nothing but living beings reacting to each other, at the different levels of being. Every being plays along, but for us humans we express our music primarily through our thinking. The collective mentality we form is, you could say, our music. Let's take a closer look at what this means for a single being, as us human beings. Now every being is essentially boundless. He has an imperishable part, which we call the monad, and cyclically the imperishable part cooperates with the learning and the perishable part. This tripartite division can be further divided into 7 principles. In man, our learning part is characterized by the 5th principle, manas, or the thinking faculty. And that thinking faculty itself is again composed of 7 thinking aspects, all of which we can distinguish in our thinking. We think harmoniously, peacefully, or justly when we apply the right thinking aspect at the right time. And we can do this best when we normally make the higher aspects leading. The point, however, is that in our evolution as human beings, we are still developing those higher aspects. Although we can recognize and use them, all 7, the middle aspects in particular, desire and intellect, are the most dominant. That said, if we begin to consciously learn to apply the thinking aspects, we can focus our thinking more and thereby create more harmony and peace in our thinking. Now the way we think defines what we work for. And the way we think precedes how we act, how we behave, and how we work. And according to the doctrine of karma, effects work out not only immediate, but also cyclic over periods that outstretch sometimes multiple lifetimes. We will repeat a few thoughts about karma from the previous lecture of this series. For a more thorough explanation I refer to the previous lecture, and so I will keep it short for now. First, karma is Sanskrit for action. So based on that meaning we can conclude directly that our work is part of our karma, as our work is one of the expressions of the way we act. Now karma is also defined as the law of cause and effect, or the law of restoration of harmony. And you could also fill in for harmony, peace or justice. The basic idea is that if everything is one living whole, then all beings intertwine, interact and interplay. If our actions are in line with the evolution of the whole, they are harmonious. If our actions counteract the effect, is disharmonious. The effects will work themselves out sooner or later. Think again about the orchestra. Now the way karma works is in short that the characteristic of the effect equals the characteristics of the characteristic of the action. So it's not only the act itself that evokes the effect, but the consciousness working behind or through the act, the motive. We all experience the difference between pushing someone out of anger or pushing someone to protect him from danger. Now one of the Theosophical teachers described karma very shortly with the sentence, karma is Atma. As Atma means the highest or divine self in every being, the conclusion is that all actions in essence originate in the divine and are the expression of free will. So free will is essential in all living beings. Although one being can express more of the free will than another, all beings have at least some amount of free will and freedom of choice, even the minutest life atom. The amount of free will depends on the development of consciousness. That means that karma works from the inside out, from spiritual to mental to the physical level. And our current development as human beings is on the mental level. Think again of the 7 aspects of thinking. If we think harmoniously, we can receive the influence from our spiritual self through our conscience and intuition. And this harmonious influence also has the effect on our physical health and forms a protection against disease. But the way we think is also reflected in our direct environment, in the people that we surround us with, family, friends, colleagues. So you can state that the people around us and circumstances are a field for our inner growth. Every human is a magnet, attracting by our mentality people with similar thoughts, consciously or unconsciously. But there is a caveat here, and that is that both love and hate are binding forces. We are attracted not only towards what we love or like, but also towards what we hate. We notice things that we dislike as much as things that we like, and do not notice the things that are indifferent to us. Like a cleaner who is full of stories about the dirtiest places he or she has come across, or a policeman or woman who knows all about crime. So this is the background why we stated that our work mirrors ourselves as a part of our karma. And with this background about the different aspects in ourselves, we can now better answer the question what our work is and what we work for. If we take the threefold division of consciousness as the starting point, you could say each of the 3 parts reflects a purpose of our work. These 3 parts can help us distinguish between 3 types of intentions of activity and 3 types of needs and wants as used in the definition of work. Firstly, we work to sustain our vehicle, and of course also those of others. We are working for a livelihood, to live and to care, for ourselves as well as for others. Secondly, working is a way to learn about ourselves and the world around us. This of course applies to jobs in the theoretical or academic field, jobs that consist of learning or collecting knowledge, scientists, researchers, advisors, consultants, etc. And jobs that translate this knowledge in practice, educators, policymakers, technologists, etc. It are those jobs that form our so-called knowledge economy. But we also work to learn in practical jobs. We work to learn skills, to apply those skills for good ends, and also to sharpen those skills. A cook not only cooks for food, but also to sharpen his skill in cooking, and that applies equally for other crafts, for carpenting, farming, or even software development. And finally, work is an important source of meaning. Work contributes significantly to a sense of dignity and can be liberating. But the question is whether the current outer work we normally do really contributes to meaning and liberation. To clarify that a bit more with these three purposes of work, we can also draw a parallel with the three forms of society outlined by Plato in his famous dialogue Republic. Plato describes three types of states. Each of those is actually a metaphor for a state of our thinking and also for a stage in our evolution as human beings through which we pass. First, he describes the unconscious state, which is a result of an unconscious state of thought. In this state, everyone naturally works for the livelihood of the community to satisfy all the necessary needs. Because people in the unconscious state still act naturally, they also work unconsciously in harmony. There are small communities in which everyone shares with one another what is needed, be it food, shelter, protection. This state can be seen as a metaphor for the early stage of human evolution, when we were still unconscious thinkers, a kind of infantile or childish state. Secondly, Plato describes the feverish state. And a feverish state is a consequence of a feverish state of thinking. In this state, everyone works to satisfy unnecessary needs for themselves, for pleasure, for luxury, or status. This describes the beginning of self-conscious thinking in human evolution, a kind of pre-puberty or puberty stage. In this stage, especially the aspects of desire begin to play a role. And this desire can be directed in two directions. On inner things, such as ideals, insight or wisdom, but also on outer things, aimed at mostly non-necessary needs or material luxury. These are then things that seem good rather than are good, as Plato describes. Like how patisserie food looks good and seems healthy, but is not. Or how makeup makes a person appear healthy, but in fact maybe not. Our current society and economy are very much like this feverish state, in which the fulfillment of all kind of unnecessary needs is still very evident. After all, if we only followed our necessary needs, why is advertising necessary? Why do we have 30 kinds of breakfast cereals or frozen pizzas? And why, instead of hundreds of types of washing machines, why don't we combine knowledge to make a few that are indestructible, durable, recyclable, and suitable for everyone? However, this is a consequence of the underlying mentality of outwardly oriented desire for possession, status, or wealth. And this desire is like drinking seawater. There is always a need for more. So Plato writes that this state will eventually seek war with its neighbors because more is always needed to satisfy the growing desire. And the grass always seems greener at the neighbor's house. So the focus on unnecessary outward desires leads to competition and struggle, and in fact also to a lot of unnecessary work. And if you think about this actually applies to whole industries. You could do away with all marketing, for instance, and advertising. And if no business had lawyers anymore, would we need lawyers? And if no country had an army anymore, would we still need armies? Costa Rica, for instance, doesn't have an army. It does have a University of Peace. Of course, Sometimes it is inevitable to intervene, even physically. But wouldn't the police force suffice? And an international naval force for security overseas? At the same time, this phase of desire thinking is also a very educational one, because it can make us wiser about how to distinguish illusion from reality. Finally, Plato describes the righteous state. It consists of three classes: the wise, the watchers or guardians, and the workers. The wise lead the state. They control their thinking and therefore their desires best. They also have the least material prosperity, the least luxury. And that is because they can be satisfied with all that is necessary. They are liberated from personal desires, from unnecessary needs and wants. And for this very reason they can also best serve the whole and direct the state. The workers produce, even for the watchers and the wise men. But they can themselves keep the most. And the watchers are thus also provided for by the state, but, like the wise, are subject to the strictest laws, which they also protect. Now in this state everyone consciously works to contribute to the whole, and thus receives what one needs. In short, everyone has its rightful place. For Plato this is a metaphor for justice or harmony, also leading to peace. What Plato describes through the metaphor of the righteous state is similar to the concept of dharma, which you also encounter in Theosophy. Dharma means duty, and literally it comes from the Sanskrit root dri, which means to support or to sustain. Supporting or sustaining the whole. It is closely related to the idea of justice from Plato, to the idea of harmony, the idea of peace. Another meaning is also our unique addition to the whole, our duty. Because each one is here in this world for a reason. Each one of us has a unique contribution to make. So each also has his work to do. And it is the easiest to find and recognize this work, this individual contribution, by overlooking the whole. Just as it is the most easy to help with cooking if you know not only a step but the whole recipe, or to help with building if you also understand the building plan. So these teachings tell us that the work that is truly liberating is rather the inner work. Inner work that aims to transcend our self-interest and focus on the whole. The boundless life that we essentially are. And the more we recognize that and start from that, the better we see what our work is. And what that liberation further means, we will explore that in the next section. For now we can conclude that our work is a reflection of ourselves, as a part of our karma, and that our outer work reflects the inner work. So let's have a break now for 3 minutes, and then we can have some time for questions. See you then.